Nancy said, are they coming? I go, no, they had a previous.
Here, so this is a good road for you.
It's a little high for me. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Testing, 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 testing. Okay.
All right, everyone. Welcome to Wofford College. I'm Nave Samhat. I have the great privilege to be the president of this fine institution. And welcome to another event in the Hipp Lecture Series on International Affairs and National Security. The center was founded by Van Hipp, 82 graduate, and of the many achievements and accomplishments in his storied career, perhaps none is greater than being the premier sideline reporter in college athletics for the Wofford Terriers. But let me introduce Van, welcome him here to introduce our guest, James Rosen. Van?
Thank you. Thank you, President Sam Hatton. What he didn't tell you, he gave me my credentials to be on the sidelines for the Carolina-Wofford game, which I believe will probably be the greatest upset in college football, even more so than when Vanderbilt beat Alabama. So anyhow, thank you, President Sam Hatton. Thank y'all for being here, and thank you for all the folks who are viewing tonight on our live stream. I want to thank you, and I do want to recognize a couple of really special guests here tonight for Wofford. One meant a lot to me that he's here. The professor emeritus of Clemson University, who was senior science advisor for Donald Rumsfeld, dear friend. He was portrayed in the movie Outbreak with Dustin Hoffman, a great American, Dr. David Gangemi, professor emeritus of Clemson, who came to be with us tonight. And then a dear friend of mine who was when I was deputy assistant secretary of the Army, we were planning the early days of then Desert Shield and Desert Storm. We were short chaplains with 82nd Airborne, our first premier unit to deploy. Reverend Ray Moore volunteered from Columbia, South Carolina. He was the longest serving chaplain on active duty in Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. And his grandson was a great tight end for the Wofford Terriers. Reverend Ray Moore, we appreciate you being here tonight. Y'all are in for a treat tonight. James Rosen is a journalist. He went to Johns Hopkins, Northwestern University, where he got his master's degree in journalism. And he started off, learning how to operate a camera, being a producer, you name it, being a great New York City reporter, a reporter in Illinois. He then a longtime Fox News correspondent. And today, of course, is the chief White House correspondent for the fastest growing network in the United States, Newsmax, which I understand the latest ratings, they've already overtaken CNN in a number of the time slots. So, just a great journalist. In fact, he's brilliant. He's funny. In fact, he was voted the funniest celebrity in Washington, D.C. So I think you're going to see what I'm talking about. He's also got kind of a cult following on social media. I tweeted out and put on Facebook and LinkedIn that James Rosen was going to be here. And man, social media blew up. Some character in California said, "We're going to be watching from California tonight." Another lady said, "He is my favorite. He's brilliant. He's funny." And she said, "And he's a huge fan of the Beatles." So you got to tell us all about the Beatles here tonight a little bit. And another an academic replied, "What a great author he is." And he talked about one of the best books he ever read was The Strong Man, John Mitchell and the Secrets of Watergate, written by James Rosen. And what a great book it was. And numerous other outstanding books. But what was interesting, when I've watched James Rosen over the years and got to know him, I said, this guy kind of reminds me of a modern day William F. Buckley. Little did I know that he received, when he graduated with his master's degree in journalism from Northwestern, he received a grant from William F. Buckley to write that book on John Mitchell. And he did a great amount of research. He actually also was a researcher for Dan Rather, and I think you edited the book on Buckley's writings, which Buckley's son said was one of the best books, probably the best book of all his dad's writings. I could go on and on, but you're in for a treat tonight. And I would just say this. This is a man who, in my opinion, epitomizes epitomizes the gold standard of American journalism in the Edward R. Burrough tradition. And what a great topic tonight, a topic everyone's talking about. What's going to happen now with the new president? And the topic of this talk tonight is back to the future. Back to the future. America and the world in the second Trump term. James Rosen, welcome to Wofford College.
All of that has the added benefit of being true. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and thanks to all who are joining remotely. I want to thank President Samhat for having me here, and of course my good friend Van Hipp, whom I've known for probably 20 plus years at this point. Just hearing Van described as a member of the graduating class of 1982 gave me great heart, because it assured me I'm now not the oldest person in the room. But it's a great honor for me to be here. I've been to all 50 states. My wife and I spent our 20th anniversary in South Carolina earlier in the summer. Went to Hilton Head. I was just telling someone that we also did the 3.5-hour drive each way in one day, so 7 hours of driving, to Macon, Georgia, to go pay our respects at the gravesite of the Allman Brothers, which is a really great trip, which I recommend. It's probably a longer drive from here, but I'm very honored to be here. And I was just talking to your vice president, who was telling me that she has been here for 42 years at this school. And that says something about your vice president, but it also says something about your school, that people like it so much that they stay that long. And I asked what changes you've seen. Have you seen a lot of changes? She said, absolutely. I said, what's the number one change you've observed in that time? And she said, well, with President Samhat, he has transformed this institution in a relatively speaking short period of time from an excellent regional academic institution into a national one. And so I congratulate you all on the great things that are happening here at Wofford, and I'm just honored to be a part of it. Somebody just now mentioned to me Lindsey Graham, the senator from South Carolina, whom I've had many, many, many run-ins with in the halls of Washington, D.C. And just mention of Lindsey Graham brought to mind one of his great moments, honestly, which nobody talks about, but I have remembered forever. This goes back to the impeachment of Bill Clinton, okay? And the students here are too young even to remember all of that craziness. But President Clinton was impeached and then acquitted at trial in the Senate over improprieties related to his affair with an intern, a White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. And, you know, there were efforts, once this became a subject of federal investigation, there were efforts to cover stuff up. And one particular set of complications involved in this whole case had to do with Mr. Clinton's White House secretary, a woman named Betty Curry, who was an older lady. And, you know, nobody imputed any wrongdoing to Betty Curry. She was, you know, just a good public servant, but there was a call that was placed, the records showed, by President Clinton to Betty Curry, okay, at 2:30 in the morning, okay? And when asked about the call, the president said he couldn't remember and she couldn't remember, et cetera, you know, but he was up to no good, you know, and President Clinton, on the day that Monica Lewinsky went to go testify before the grand jury, did an event in the Rose Garden, and he wore a tie that she had given him as a gift, okay? Little subtle signal like, hey, you and me got a future, don't rat me out now, you know, whatever. So he was capable of this sort of, you know, deviousness. And I met him many times as well. But I'll never forget what Lindsey Graham said. He was a congressman at the time. He wasn't a senator. He was a congressman from South Carolina. And he was what they call a House impeachment manager, which is one of the prosecutors. Those of you who remember the Trump impeachment trials may remember some of this terminology and the process and so forth. But he was talking about the call to Betty Curry. And Congressman Lindsey Graham said, where I come from, you calling someone up at 2:30 in the morning, you up to no good. Truer words were never spoken. So we are blessed, I think, to convene at a time of such serenity and calmness, both here in our domestic politics and on the world stage. The truth is, I think I probably speak for every one of you and all those watching remotely when I say how grateful I am that the very best outcome of the 2024 presidential contest, crazy as it was, was that it actually ended on election night. How great was that, okay? Without violence, without lawsuits. Oh my God. Like my childhood. I mean, in my childhood, I grew up on Staten Island in New York. And I worked hard to lose that accent, by the way. If you'd like to hear the accent, I'll do what he's doing is going dance Atlanta. All right. But when I grew up, election day was like it was a fine day. It was a happy day. It was autumnal. There were leaves and you got off of school and so forth, but nobody felt unsafe. Nobody was putting plywood up on their glass, as happened on every restaurant and storefront opposite the White House 3 weeks ago. I remember, of course, from the riots of 2020 in Washington, there came a point where the growth industry in the nation's capital were the groups of Mexican day laborers who were putting up plywood on stores, which is tragic. And so it's sad to see that election day has become a fearful moment for us. But maybe the results of 2024 will put us back in the right direction in that regard. I know Van gave you a basic outline of my career. I spent 19 years at the Fox News Channel. I covered the White House, the State Department, and then I was the chief Washington correspondent for about, 7 or 8 years. I've been to 53 countries on 5 continents. I've ridden Air Force One many times, Air Force Two many times. I interviewed Condoleezza Rice when she was the Secretary of State 4 times in different countries. Same for Hillary Clinton. I can remember I accompanied Hillary Clinton on her first trip as Secretary of State, her first foreign trip as Secretary of State, which was to Asia, the pivot to Asia. And in a foreign policy center, we can talk about the pivot to Asia. But so I got to interview her in Seoul, South Korea. And I'd had some interactions with her off camera. And the truth about Hillary Clinton was she was a much more fun person to be around when the camera wasn't on. She'd have a drink, she'd slosh around the brown liquor with you, and she'd talk to you about the Beatles and stuff like that. And I remember a group of us asking, well, what was it about the Beatles? Why did you? Well, first of all, they were really cute, she said, and, hearkening to the boy band era of the Beatles. But when the red light went on, suddenly she became lawyerly and spoke like this and became utterly charmless. And that's what the country got to see, unfortunately. But in that interview in Seoul, South Korea, having asked the very challenging questions I wanted to ask about North Korea's nuclear program at that time, she was refusing to acknowledge that they had a second pathway to a nuclear bomb. There's plutonium and there's uranium. And we all knew about the plutonium, but the uranium thing was in some dispute, but not to me. It was pretty clear, the intelligence at that time, and she was refusing to sort of acknowledge. In the end, they detonated a uranium-powered nuclear weapon, a nuclear device. So that was not in doubt at that point. But once I got through the hard stuff, you get to the back of the book, I can have a little fun. And I said, so Madam Secretary, I know you're a fan of the Beatles, as I am. Would you say that you prefer the infectious melodies and hand clapping of the early Beatles period, or do you prefer their later world-weary, drug-fueled Beatles? Which are you into? Well, James, as you know, it so often depends on your mood, and which is true, I suppose. Sometimes I want to hear early Beatles and sometimes mid-Beatles. And I just feel lucky, she said, to have been alive in the time of Lennon and McCartney. And I totally got that sentiment. My 2 sons, their middle names are Lennon and McCartney, okay? That's the level of neurosis that you're dealing with tonight. And my wife's patience, of course. And I said to her, do you have a favorite song? And she spoke about Hey Jude. And I then said to her, well, that's fine. I suppose it would have been asking too much to request that the Secretary of State, on her very first overseas trip, advocate on behalf of revolution. And then John Kerry, did many interviews with him. George W. Bush, I used to bring somebody every year to the White House Christmas party as my guest. They have a Christmas party for the press. You get to take your picture with the president and the first lady. And I brought my dad. Now, my dad is now 90, retired. He spent 60 some odd years as a classmate at Brooklyn Law School of Alan Dershowitz, practicing law. And he practiced that most reviled area of the law called catastrophic personal injury trial law. Okay. Maybe known in parts down south as ambulance chaser or what have you, who remembers such slights? But my brother and I were raised to be very risk-averse people, You know, oh really? You want to make toast? You want to see pictures of people, 80% of their bodies burnt, scarred from toast making? You want to see it? You know, whatever, you know, your every waking moment was going to lead inexorably, not only to catastrophic personal injury, but to the natural end state destination of all mankind thereafter, which is protracted and expensive litigation. And so we were raised to be very risk averse. But I brought my dad to the White House. And you know, you sort of slowly move up this line in the basement of the White House to the room where they have the camera set up and the first lady and the president. And each interaction, each picture is maybe 60 seconds, you know, and you keep going. And you fill out a card, and that gets passed up. And then when you're close, there's a Marine in full dress uniform who reads out the card. And as I got close, I said, now, Dad, I'm telling you, Bush is going to address your son as Rosie. That was my nickname. People got nicknames from George W. Bush, and I was Rosie. And I said, he's going to call me Rosie. Just you wait for it. Mr. James Rosen of Fox News and his father, Myron Rosen of Staten Island. Rosie, right? First thing he says, Rosie, you moving up in the world, Rosie? And I said, Mr. President, my father here is a New York catastrophic personal injury lawyer. Okay, now the Bush-Cheney administration worked hard to try and put trial lawyers out of business. Okay, they wanted to do this called tort reform, and it would cap injury awards and so forth and make life a lot less lucrative for trial lawyers. They didn't succeed. And I now have the benefit of viewing the subject of tort reform absent the lens of, gosh, it is my dad. But in any case, I said, Mr. President, my dad here is a New York catastrophic personal injury trial lawyer. Is this going to get us bounced out of the photo? This was right around the time that Vice President Cheney's chief of staff, a man named Scooter Libby, had been indicted by a special prosecutor in a very complex set of events. And Bush just looked at me and he sort of airily buttoned his jacket and looked away and he said, I could probably use a good lawyer right about now. He was like, get in. Welcome to the people's house. Appreciate you coming. And then, you know, I can go through all the presidents, and I've had some dealings with all of them. And maybe some of you know that under the Obama administration, I was subjected to FBI surveillance that was eventually disclosed. And that as part of all that, the FBI designated me in writing in a sealed application for a search warrant that was granted by a federal judge that I didn't know anything about. The opportunity to look through all of my phone records and my Gmail account and so forth to investigate where I was getting my information from in some of the reporting I did for Fox News about North Korea and its nuclear weapons program and other subjects. That had never happened before. I was the FBI agent who swore out a signed statement and notarized it to be a sworn statement under penalty of perjury, wrote that James Rosen of Fox News is a criminal co-conspirator in a violation of the Espionage Act of 1917 for publishing classified information. Now, there's a guy, he died not long ago, his name was Neil Sheehan. He was a reporter for the New York Times. In June 1971, Neil Sheehan published on the front page of the New York Times something called the Pentagon Papers, which was a classified study of how America got so deeply involved in Vietnam that was commissioned internally by the Defense Department. They had their own historians who had top secret clearances looking at all the cables and all the tapes and all the documents and how the hell did this disaster really take shape the way it did. The Pentagon Papers was a study that consisted of 7,000 pages of classified documents. The New York Times started running them on the front page. Nixon went to the Supreme Court to get it shut down. He got a partial victory. They shut it down for a little while, but the Supreme Court basically said, no, 6-3, you can keep publishing. Not even Neil Sheehan was designated as a criminal co-conspirator in a violation of the Espionage Act by the Nixon administration. No one had ever done that until the Obama administration. And that secret search warrant application, which they used to rummage through my private emails and phone records and the phone records of my parents on Staten Island, I didn't know about it for 4 years. It was supposed to be kept. They got the thing signed, and then they said, well, we want to keep it secret for 18 months. And let's be clear, there's a difference between a subpoena. When you receive a subpoena, show up at the courthouse, or I forget the Latin term, subpoena tucus dusum or something like that, which means show up with your documents at the courthouse, right? You're being summoned by the grand jury. You know when you've received a subpoena. This was a secret search warrant application, filed in secret, approved in secret, that I didn't know about. And then once it was approved, they asked the judge, can we keep it secret for 18 months? The judge said no. Then they went judge shopping, and they took it to another judge who said no. And then they took it to a third judge who said, yes, you may keep it secret for 18 months. And then it was kept secret for 36 months. And then when that secrecy on that document lapsed and it was filed in court, the Washington Post found it and broke the story on May 20th, 2013. Who remembers? Rosen of Fox News subjected to spying. And it became a big story. Briefly, I outtrended my fellow celebrities Justin Bieber and Taylor Swift on Twitter. I was wiped off the front pages by a guy named Eric Snowden, who had worked for the National Security Agency and stole a whole bunch of its stuff and then gave it out sort of to WikiLeaks. When all that became public, President Obama had a pre-scheduled speech at National Defense University in Washington on counterterrorism. But because this was such a big issue at that point, like you called a reporter a criminal for doing his job. I mean, Bob Woodward walks out with classified maps at the White House and nobody stops him, you know. It was pretty clear this was a selective prosecution of a Fox News reporter. And the case confounded a lot of people. Wait a minute, if you're on the left, Fox News has real reporters? They break stories about North Korea and its nuclear weapons program? Really, they do serious work like that? You know, and the liberals, who would ordinarily be the ones saying, you can't lock up a member of the press, were like, gosh, you can lock up this one maybe, right? And the conservatives, who ordinarily be like, lock up the wretched, ink-stained wretch for spilling our secrets into the, were like, hey, he's from Fox News. You know, you can't do this. So it confounded people's expectations. But the president that day at National Defense University pronounced himself troubled by the notion of a working reporter being criminalized for doing his job. And so in what passed for accountability from Mr. Obama, he appointed, to get to the bottom of how this novel designation occurred, the man who signed off on it, the Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder, who publicly described himself as President Obama's wingman. In the real throes of this controversy, you know, I'm sitting in my office at Fox News watching the daily White House press briefing with the press secretary at that time, a guy named Jay Carney, whom I had known. He'd been a Time magazine reporter. We had traveled together. And my office mate was a good friend of mine, a reporter named Doug McKelway. And he was assigned to cover the Rosen story. No reporter in the history of mankind has had an easier time of it than Doug McKelway, because everything he needed to know for his story. And when was the thing okay, thanks. Right? And, you know, you could just ask. I'm sitting right there. But I'm sitting there watching, like, this TV of the press briefing being dominated by questions about when did the president know about the Rosen's, you know, search warrant and so forth. And it turned out that 5 days before the Washington Post broke that story on May 20, 2013, so May 15, 2013, Attorney General Holder had testified as a routine matter before the House Judiciary Committee on a variety of subjects. And he was asked on that occasion about the potential prosecution of a member of the news media for the unlawful disclosure of classified information. And Attorney General Holder said, and I'm quoting directly now, got this seared into my brain. He said, in terms of the potential prosecution of a member of the news media for the unlawful disclosure of classified information, he said, that's not something I've ever heard of or been involved in or would think would be wise policy. 5 days later, this designation of me as a criminal for just that kind of reporting surfaced, and he acknowledged that he had signed off on this historic, never-before-done designation. And I remember watching Tom Brokaw on NBC News being asked, do you think the Attorney General will be able to keep his job? I don't see how he can, he said. But sure enough, Obama appointed the man who did this to look into how it happened. Procedural reforms were enacted, and life went on. And that wasn't even my only sort of trouble with the Obama administration. We will come to foreign policy in the Trump term, I promise you. So in 2016, would this be? No, 2013 as well, I got a tip from a source who said, we are conducting secret talks with Iran about their nuclear program. Now, we don't have diplomatic relations with Iran. We have not since they stormed our embassy in 1979 and took all our people hostage, which you've seen in the movie Argo. And So if we were having secret talks with Iran, that's a big deal. So I just marched into the State Department press briefing room for their daily press briefing. The briefer back then was a lady named Victoria Nuland, whom I knew well. She was until recently the number 3 person at the State Department. She rose over time. And I said, Victoria, from time to time we hear that the United States is engaged in secret direct talks with Iran about their nuclear program and perhaps other subjects. Is that presently the case? And she says, no. She said, in terms of types of bilateral talks you're talking about, absolutely not, no. Next question. Okay. 6-7 months go by, and the Obama administration announces with great fanfare, we have the framework of a deal with the Iranians to control their nuclear program in exchange for the lifting of economic sanctions and so forth. And they say, we'll give you a background briefing at 4 o'clock, which for reporters means the officials are going to talk to you. You're not allowed to quote them by name. You can only say senior officials said or whatever. And in the background briefings, guess what? Well, how did this all come about? Well, 6-7 months ago, through our friends Oman, another Middle Eastern country that does have relations with Iran, we had the Omani channel, and our people flew secretly to Oman, Jake Sullivan, who's now the White House National Security Advisor, and Bill Burns, who's now the CIA director, back, 13 years ago or whatever, 12 years ago, flew to Oman and met directly with the Iranians. Now, if you piece together the chronology as I did, this was right smack when I was asking that question. So I marched into the briefing room again. It's now 6-7 months later, whatever it is. And the briefer now is a lady named Jen Psaki, whom I knew quite well from the 2008 campaign and et cetera. And I said, Jen, I should like to read to you from the transcript of the briefing in this very room of February 6th of this year. And with my greatest dramatic, sort of reading voice, literary voice. Question, Victoria, from time to time we hear about yada, yada, yada. Answer, no. In terms of the kind of bilateral discussions you're talking about, absolutely not. End quote. Jen, when Ms. Nuland gave that answer to my question, was it accurate? Well, James, I don't have anything for you that's new on the origin of the Iran talks and, the sort of standard back and forth between the reporter and the briefer. And that sort of cat and mouse goes on. And so we're at it for 7 minutes. And I finally say in the 8th minute, Jen, let me take one more stab at this with your indulgence and that of my colleagues, because I had monopolized 8 minutes of the State Department press briefing that day. I said, is it the policy of this administration, the Obama administration, that in order to preserve the secrecy of secret negotiations, it is permissible to lie to the public and to the press? And she said, finally, in this, the 8th minute, well, James, as you know, there are times when diplomacy requires secrecy, and this was one of those times. Boom, done, thank you. Okay, CBS News, New York Times, Politico, Fox, everybody covered it. In essence, Psaki says Nuland lied. Okay? And that's pretty much the state of it. Fast forward 2.5 more years. It's now 2016. Mr. Obama's not running for re-election. Or he can't, he's out. So Hillary Clinton ran, as you all know. And there was a guy in the Obama White House named Ben Rhodes. Ben had been he was much younger than me. I had a lot more hair than him, but he had been a creative writing guy and somehow found himself as the White House Deputy National Security Advisor. Okay, hugely important guy. Had been a speechwriter for Obama, but now he was literally the number 2 guy in the White House national security infrastructure. Hugely influential guy. And he did something very stupid. Ben gave permission to the New York Times Sunday magazine to assign a reporter who could follow him around for a week. Why would you do that? Right? I mean, you're ticking down the clock on this administration. If you want to spill your guts to the New York Times, wait, And he said a lot of ill-advised things to the reporter for that splashy front cover of the Sunday Times magazine in 2016, including, we sold the Iran deal to the American people because we created an echo chamber. We spread around money to this think tank and that think tank, and we gave them talking points, and they just parroted it. And he said, guess what? Most of the reporters who cover foreign policy in Washington, they're 27 and they know nothing, he said. It's a blob. The foreign policy establishment is a blob. Now, I knew how they sold the Iran nuclear deal. There was Ben Rhodes appearing on CNN with Wolf Blitzer saying we are going to have 24/7 access to all nuclear sites in Iran. Well, the final deal didn't have that. Plenty of important sites were left off the inspection list. And that's just one example. Barack Obama, as a senator, campaigned for the presidency in 2007 by promising that he would shut down Iran's uranium enrichment program. And guess what the nuclear deal did? It allowed them to continue enriching uranium. Not to nuclear bomb levels, but still they didn't shut down the program. So I was assigned, Rosen, you're going to do the story about Ben Rhodes' ridiculous interview with the New York Times Magazine. Got it. Said to my producer, I know how they sold the nuclear deal. I want you to go back to 2013 on the official State Department website page where they have the briefings, the video of the briefings, which is the official video of it. And I want you to find the briefing in February of 2013 where Toria Nuland said to me, no, we're not talking to Iran. And then I want you to find Jen Psaki 8 months later saying, sometimes diplomacy requires secrecy, and this was one of those times. He comes back, my producer, an hour later, says, you're not going to believe this. I said, what's that? He said, I went to the page at the State Department's official website, which is the official repository of the official videos of the briefings. And at that one with Jen Psaki where you broke her down over 8 minutes, that whole 8 minutes is replaced by a white flash on either side of which Jen's head can be seen moving abruptly. I said, you're kidding. He said, no, it's gone. I said, what about the official transcript, which is on another page, the official State Department transcripts of the briefing? It's still in there. Now, this was a quixotic effort because there's something called the Pool in Washington, which is staffed by ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, and CNN, 5 networks that share and rotate the duties and the costs associated with covering the White House, the State Department, et cetera. And the press pool always travels with the president, wherever he goes, or with the Secretary of State, what have you. So the pool had the video. We all record the pool transmission in our different newsrooms. Everyone had this video. So what you thought you were going to accomplish by erasing 8.5 minutes of it was kind of crazy. Nonetheless, there it was. The white flash and Jen on either side in 8 minutes gone. So I called up the briefer at that point, who was a lady named Liz Trudeau, who I'd known. She had been a spokesperson for NATO in Brussels. And I said, we're very upset about this. We're going to lead Bret Baier's show with this, and we want those 8 minutes put back. She's like, okay, I don't know what the heck this is about. Let me look at it, et cetera. And she ran the press office in a sense, but the spokesman at that time was Admiral John Kirby, whom you might have seen me mixing it up with in more recent press briefings at the White House. And he apologized publicly for this. And 2 investigations were held at the State Department, one by the press office and one by L, which on the sort of flow chart of the State Department refers to the legal counsel for the State Department. And they found the lady in her 60s, a lifer, a bureaucrat, whose job it was every day to upload the file of the briefing, that video file, once they stopped shooting, to the page where it lives in posterity, in perpetuity, right? And she said, I received a phone call from a superior of mine, a woman, who told me who instructed me to insert that white flash. And I recall that she mentioned James Rosen and Fox News and Iran. But for the life of me, I don't remember who she was. There are only so many boxes of official state repression that the state can check off against an individual reporter. So here we have illegal surveillance of me and my family. Now we have censorship, raw censorship. So I showed up, by the way, every day in the briefings, just having great sport with this and asking Admiral Kirby, John, the individual who works the camera to shoot these briefings for the State Department is a federal employee, yes? The camera that was used was federal equipment, was it not? The file that is created is a federal document, is it not? Because the Federal Records Act of 1950 makes it a crime to tamper with a federal record. So if I went to the National Archives and I got out some memorandum from Henry Kissinger to Richard Nixon, and I started to take out a Sharpie and just draw Mickey Mouse on the thing, that's a crime, okay? You're tampering with a federal record. And of course, John saw the direction of that questioning and didn't want to entertain any of that, but it was a crime. I suppose I should consider myself fortunate just to be here talking to you, given that box has not yet been checked. Who knows? We come to the present era. And I want to talk about a couple of things with you. In January 19 of 2022, Joe Biden was approaching his first anniversary the next day as president of the United States, 1 year in office. and he held a news conference in the East Room of the White House. We were still wearing masks. You had to wear the mask. You would not get into the East Room if you didn't wear the mask. I wore the mask. And it was a standard news conference, lasts about an hour. He had about 10 questioners. They were supplied to him by his staff, and Mr. Biden did his fumbling thing of, all right, next, who do we got here? James, he wouldn't call on me, but, Van Hype of Bloomberg, go ahead, and he would just get the names wrong and sort of, but he'd done it for an hour, and that's typically the end. But there was such a clamor in the back of the East Room from the shutout reporters, including this one, that quite surprisingly, and this speaks to Joe Biden's generosity, but not really any measure of astuteness, he decided to extend the press conference. And he looked at his watch, how long you guys want to stay? And we were like, more. And so he said, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll stay here till everyone's gotten a question. And I could just see Jen Psaki and the other press aides looking like, oh my God, what is he doing? And it turned out not to be a smart move because he said a lot of very ill-advised things in the second hour. It turned out to be the longest presidential news conference in history, over 2 hours. When he got to me, I rose and I said, thank you for this honor, Mr. President. James Rosen with Newsmax. And if you look at the video, you could see at that point he looks off as if to say, who the hell let this happen? Okay, he was vice president during all of that stuff with the State Department and the FBI and so on. And I said, Mr. President, I'd like to raise a delicate subject with you, but with utmost concern for your lifetime accomplishment and for the high office you hold. I said, a poll was released this morning by Politico/Morning Consult, which is nobody's idea of a right-wing outlet. And I said, the poll found that 46% of registered voters disagreed with the statement, quote, Joe Biden is mentally fit. And he starts to chuckle. And I said, not even a majority of Democrats, only 43% was willing strongly to affirm the statement. Well, I'll leave it to you as to why. I said, well, Mr. President, if you'd allow me to finish. Why do you suppose it is that such large segments of the American electorate have come to harbor such profound concerns about your cognitive fitness? Thank you. Now, I didn't expect the president to spend a whole lot of time on that enemy terrain, okay? And frankly, a more gifted kind of respondent like Barack Obama could have left me as roadkill. Because you got BS outlets like yours pumping out BS, right? And I'd be roadkill. There would be nothing I could do about it. Biden said as follows, I have no idea, and pointed at the next person. Now, when a man tells you, I have no idea, he is, in a sense, speaking to a mind that is empty. And to many eyes, the answer validated the question. But amongst my colleagues in the White House Correspondents Association, in which I've been a member in good standing for most of the last 25 years, and amongst the press corps at the White House, and certainly by the White House press team, I was made to feel rude and fringy for posing that question at that time. And Jen Psaki and her successor, Karine Jean-Pierre, blackballed me from asking any questions in any setting at the White House, in the press briefing room, in the background briefings that I mentioned, on calls, background calls. Didn't get a question, didn't get called on for 8 months. 8 months in the penalty box for asking that very respectfully framed question. Now, lo and behold, after the events of this summer, I think we can all see that the question of Mr. Biden's cognitive fitness and the public concern surrounding it eventually emerged as the defining issue of his presidency. And we've never had a situation like that, at least in the modern media age where presidents are exposed so routinely to the public spotlight. And it raises very novel questions, and historians will have to grapple with it. Once it became impossible to ignore, once it became impossible just to blackball James Rosen and deal with the problem that way, it was always a quixotic effort at a cover-up because there's only so much you can do to shield the president of the United States from public appearances. Once it became impossible to attribute this to cheap fake videos, which is one of Karine's coinages in the briefing room, it raises very serious questions about how the presidency was conducted all along. Because it's not like he had a bum leg here, okay? Or, it's not like covering up the infirmity of Franklin Roosevelt, okay? because in theory, that infirmity should not have had any impact on President Roosevelt's deliberations as the commander-in-chief in World War II and so on. But when you're talking about the president's mind and not just the caliber of his mind, but the well-being of his mind, that raises very serious questions. And we have a lot still to go and to learn about how this all unfolded. The first way you're going to learn about it is going to be when people, for money, write their memoirs and start retailing, again, for money, little anecdotes about what they observed on the inside. After the memoirs, we're going to start to see documents come out eventually. And all of this could not have been managed without some paper or electronic trail of texts and, and so you'll learn more about this. But it's frightening to me, and I'm actually having chills just talking to you about it. The idea of a president who is non-compos mentis or in this case, I think it'd be going a bit far to call Mr. Biden that. He showed moments of lucidity, but who is intermittently, perhaps, non-compos mentis is frightening enough. And then we come to the present day. Believe me, it's so great. You're going to get tired of listening. You're going to get tired of winning. And my interactions with President Trump have been fleeting because I didn't cover the White House when he was in office the first time. But I had some interactions with him, and in March of 2023, we had the CPAC convention. You know what CPAC is? Conservative Political Action Committee, I think it's called. It's an activist group. Ronald Reagan was one of the champions of CPAC. Of course, the Republican Party, the conservative movement is very different than it was in Reagan's time. And Mr. Trump has been a favorite of CPAC. So here he was. I was invited to a news conference with former President Trump, then former President Trump, at CPAC, which is held at this this resort outside Washington called the Gaylord. Is the name of the hotel. It's the National Harbor, it's called. And I was one of only 10 reporters. And when I got there, it was just a nondescript room, maybe 1/4 the size of this room, with some American flags and a velvet rope. And that was it. And, the only other reporter I really kind of recognized was Meredith McGraw of Politico, and the rest were from outlets that we might say are more conservative than Newsmax. And the reporters from which asked Mr. Trump questions along the lines of, are you great or really, really great? The other complication here was that there was no live transmission. So we all shot this with our camera folks, what they would say to tape, which is a bygone 20th century term. But basically, we recorded it, and after it was over, we would all run back to our hotel rooms and feed it out to our respective institutions, and they played out to the world. When it was my turn for a question like this, and I said, Mr. President, thank you, James Rosen with Newsmax, and he went like this. Like, I know of you. Yes, you and I are cultured men. Go ahead. And I said, Mr. President, now look, there's ways to frame questions, okay, that will get you an answer that you can use. And there's ways to frame questions where you're not going to get any good answer, but hey, you'll be on TV for asking it in the most hostile possible way, right? I can go back to another incident with Nancy Pelosi, but in the interest of time, I won't, where I had to yell out a question to her as she was leaving a press conference because she refused to call on me because we'd gotten into it in a previous thing. And I yelled out the question, do you hate the president, Madam Speaker? It was during the first impeachment of Mr. Trump. She wheeled around. You accused me, and the memes showed like lightning from her finger, like blowing me up. And like, she marched back to the podium, and she, the press conference was over, and she was, it was one of those electric things. She's like, the president is a coward, she screamed. And she said, I'm a Catholic. I was not raised with hate in my heart. How dare you accuse me of hate? And I said, I didn't accuse you. I asked you a question. Do you hate the president? Now, had she called on me, and she was toying with me. She was looking right at me and going like this, because I was in the front row. You. Okay? I was the only person at that news conference who she sent her minions out in advance to say, which outlet are you with again? So I knew it was personal. Now, had she called on me, I would have said, Madam Speaker, President Trump alleges that this entire impeachment episode derives not from fidelity to the Constitution, but from personal animus that you and the other Democrats have toward him. So let's clear the air. Do you hate the president, Madam Speaker? But she didn't give me that chance to have a flowery wind-up. So I just had to yell it out. Do you hate the president, Madam Speaker, with her back to me? I didn't really think she was going to stop. They never do. But she wheeled around, pointing. And her conduct made it very clear that she hated the president and me. And within 2 days on eBay, there were 35 varieties of hoodies and sweatshirts with the back of my head in them, and her pointing at me and saying, because her last words were, "Don't mess with me." And boom, 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 boom. A brittle character. So at CPAC, I said to him, "Mr. President, this run for the presidency, your third, obviously unfolds against a very different backdrop than those that attended your first two campaigns, insofar as we have the presence of these 4 pending criminal investigations, the one in New York, the one in Georgia, and the 2 from the special counsel at that time." I said, "Now I know that you regard these investigations as politically motivated witch hunts, but nonetheless, we are given to understanding that one or more of these cases will soon reach a point of disposition that may involve the handing down of charges. And so I wonder if you would seize this opportunity here at CPAC to assure your donors and your supporters that you'll stay in this race regardless of what happens in those investigations, even if you're indicted 1 or more times." Now, if I had just blurted out, "You stay in the race if you get indicted," it would not go over well. But I sort of had a chance to sort of soften it, but nonetheless get the essential core question asked. And he said, "It's a horrible thing. It's been going on. It can happen to any president. And he did 30 or 40 seconds of not really answering the questions. And when I had my moment, which I call the art of interjection, where you have to recognize the space you're about to have, keep it tight, project, I said, "So you'll stay in the race?" "Oh, absolutely. I would never think of leaving." And he spoke for about 15 more seconds. Then he said, "It'll probably only enhance my numbers." And of course, he turned out to be quite prescient in all of that. But boom, global headlines. We all retreat to our hotel rooms to feed out the thing. I had taken a still photograph of him with my camera, and I tweeted out with the photograph, "Former President Trump tells me he will stay in the race, quote, even if indicted 1 or more times," right? Bam. My phone starts lighting up. We haven't fed the stuff out yet. Fox News. Maggie Haberman of the New York Times. "Hey, James, long time no chat. Hey, do you got that video?" Et cetera. And I said, "Be patient, it's coming." Global headlines, Trump will stay in race. Why do I tell this to you? Because it's important for me that you understand that regardless of where I work or my own particular political views or preferences or predilections, you've now just heard where I made global headlines being the first and for 2.5 years, the only reporter to ask President Biden about what were already in 2022 very serious concerns about his cognitive fitness. And then the following year, you've seen that I made global news asking not the most welcome question of former President Trump as well. That's what a real reporter does. They don't care which side's playing. We don't have a horse in the race. If you're a really good reporter, you just want the game to be played either spectacularly well or spectacularly badly so that it makes it more interesting to write about. Witness the Gates nomination. Our actual theme tonight of Back to the Future, America and the World in the Second Trump Term, Mr. Trump approaches the presidency now in a very different way than he did in 2017. He has established pretty firm control over the Republican Party that he did not enjoy in 2017. And some of the past chairs of county and state parties here in this room know this firsthand. And he seems determined to approach what he would call the swamp in a more determined and swift way. One of the great failings of the first Trump term was that they really didn't hit the ground and get their people in. And the people he surrounded himself with were people he didn't even like or trust very much. And that's on him. When you run for office and say, "We're going to hire only the best people," and then you wind up firing the Secretary of State you chose and calling him, quote, "dumb as a box of rocks," that calls your own hiring ability into question, it should seem. But this time around, he's determined to put real loyalists into key positions to a fault. And in the closing days of the first Trump term, they tried to ram through something called Schedule F. Anyone here know what Schedule F refers to? I think we have someone who does. My son. And pardon me, I'm so sorry about that. Schedule F was an attempt late in the Trump term. There's 2.2 million federal employees. 50,000 of them enjoy protection in the civil service that if Schedule F were adopted, they would lose. And they would be hireable and fireable at the pleasure of the president for any reason or no reason at all, just like Jim Comey was. And they're going to hit the ground running with Schedule F this time. So there's a real determined effort to wrap their arms around the federal bureaucracy and bend it to their will. Part of that is an effort to restore presidential control over the Department of Justice, not just through the appointment of a loyalist like Mr. Gates, but through an absolute doing away with the post-Watergate norm that the White House shall leave the Department of Justice pretty much alone and not have any say in who it investigates and so forth. In the views of Mr. Trump and his advisors, and these are not savages. These are some very bright people who have given lawyers and historians and economists. These are people who have given a lot of thought to this, who feel that the Department of Justice should be no more insulated from presidential control than the Department of Agriculture or the Department of Education. And so all this will have to play out. Where foreign policy and America's role in the world is concerned, again, Mr. Trump now approaches the office knowing these world leaders, okay, having dealt with them as a president, having fielded their calls furtively over the past 4 years. He inherits a world on fire, as we all know, in the Middle East, in Ukraine. One thing we can say about Donald Trump is he does not really exhibit the signs of being an interventionist. He doesn't want to send your sons and daughters off to war to die for something abstract. And in fact, he kept the use of the military to an absolute minimum in his 4 years. One of the most effective uses of the military by Mr. Trump as commander-in-chief was to order the strike that took out General Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and the chief mastermind of their foreign terror operations for 30 years. That was a really extraordinary thing. Mr. Trump is not bound by kind of the conventions, let's say, that have governed foreign policy thinking for 50, 60 years. Fine, I'll go meet with Kim Jong-un. What's it cost me, right? And North Korea was pretty quiet in his turn. Where those two conflicts are concerned, the Middle East and Ukraine, every indication we have from former President Trump, the candidate, the 2024 candidate, is that he's going to seek to get those conflicts off the books. And he might have to do it at the expense of Ukrainian sovereignty and territory, which is precisely the principle that the Biden administration, I think commendably, has sought to uphold. That if Putin thinks he can just run over Ukraine, what's next? And not just what's next in Europe, what's next for the next tin horn dictator out there who wants to run over a country? Let's say China and Taiwan. If we just let Putin do what he wanted in Ukraine, how would Xi Jinping, the president of China, process that vis-a-vis his desire to reclaim control of Taiwan, which controls something like 63% of all semiconductor chip manufacturing in the world, and which is a democratic ally of ours? So there was an important principle in upholding Ukraine's territorial sovereignty and integrity, but Mr. Trump is transactional. He's a deal maker, and this is bad for business, and it needs to stop. So it's quite conceivable he's going to force the Ukrainians to accept the territory they've lost, which would be a violation of international law, and it would reward Putin in essence for his aggression. By the same token, the Russians have suffered terribly in this entire episode. Their military has been decimated. They have sustained hundreds of thousands of deaths, and they've been exposed as a kind of a paper tiger. And now they have North Korean troops fighting for them on their own soil, and they're dependent on Iran and North Korea for drones and bullets and things. So perhaps Mr. Putin will be eager to end it as well. But I submit to you that apart from, and after this I'll be happy to take a couple of questions or as many as we have. Aside from those two conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine, and of course we should pause to note about the Middle East that he has a much better relationship with Bibi Netanyahu than Mr. Biden did. And as president of the United States, Mr. Trump moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which had been a goal of the Israelis for decades. No American president had supported it. He brought together the Abraham Accords, which for the first time saw diplomatic relations established between Israel and three of its Arab neighbors, UAE, Bahrain. I'm trying to think of the others. There were two others that followed along, okay, with Saudi Arabia being likely to follow. Many people think that the Hamas attack of October 7 so horrific in Israel, the equivalent, given Israel's population and size, to 15 9/11s on one day for them. A lot of people think that that attack was undertaken to derail what we're shaping up under the Biden administration as a follow-on to the Abraham Accords that would put Israel and Saudi Arabia with diplomatic relations. Mind-blowing if you grew up in the 70s, the idea that those two countries would have diplomatic relations. But they have a common enemy in Iran now. And the geopolitics had settled in a way where the Saudis, the UAE, who made peace with Israel and under the Abraham Accords, felt it was better to make peace with Israel than carry on some ancient Arab-Israeli conflict. And that was going to happen without the creation of a Palestinian state. And a lot of people think that's why Hamas attacked when it did. Obviously, the war that's been conducted by Mr. Netanyahu since then has been very controversial and deadly. The question we have to ask about that is, was there a way for Benjamin Netanyahu, as the Prime Minister of Israel, to conduct the war against Hamas in Gaza against an enemy that, as a programmatic matter, entrenches itself in civilian population centers, okay, and effectively get rid of Hamas and kill fewer Palestinian civilians? Was there a way to do that? And if there was, should it have been readily visible to Mr. Netanyahu? And if so, how many fewer civilians? Could he have accomplished what he needed to accomplish and killed 50% of the civilians who died? Could he have accomplished what he needed to accomplish, as he has, and killed 10% fewer Palestinians? We'll never know. But, his severest critics don't have an answer for that question. And I've interviewed Netanyahu as well in 2020 in Blair House. At that time, he was struggling. He would win the elections, but he couldn't form a coalition government. And so they'd have to have another election. He went something like 3 elections in 15 months. And I said to him, Mr. Prime Minister, should we gaze upon you the way we gazed upon Muhammad Ali at the end of his career? Someone who had once been dominant in his arena and now is struggling to put away lesser individuals and struggling to put together a coalition government. And he said to me, well, I have been the longest serving Israeli Prime Minister. I'd like to think I have something left in me. And sure enough, he did, because he was voted out of office and now he's come back. But Mr. Trump is going to be more sympathetic to the Israeli position. But he's a deal maker, and he's been in business with LIV, which is the Saudi-formed Gulf organization. His first trip as president of the United States was to where? Who remembers? His first foreign trip as president of the United States was to Saudi Arabia. So he's not blind to Israel's critics. But I submit to you that the foreign policy in the early, let's say the first 90 days at least of the Trump administration, perhaps the whole first year, you're going to see attention shifted from Israel and Ukraine, Gaza and Lebanon, and Ukraine to Latin America. Why? Because he has made it very clear that his top priority as president of the United States is a hybrid issue that is both domestic and foreign policy at the same time, and that is the issue of illegal immigration in this country. And if he follows through on these plans for some kind of mass deportation, starting with the most dangerous of those illegal immigrants who are here, it's going to involve extensive diplomacy with Latin American nations and Central American nations. And, he's going to, as all presidents do, face headwinds and speed bumps, if I can mix my metaphors, and it's not going to go so easily. And he's going to find that some of these Latin American countries are going to demand something in exchange for accepting the return of some of the so-called undesirables. And that's going to be a project for him and his team. Every indication we have is that he intends this time to run immigration policy out of the White House. He's appointed his very close aide, and who was an architect of this policy in the first term, Stephen Miller, to be the deputy White House chief of staff for operations. Just about as important a job in the White House as there is, and powerful. And he has appointed Tom Homan, familiar to the Fox News viewers here, as a border czar. What's significant about those appointments is they don't require Senate confirmation. He has signaled his intention to nominate Governor Kristi Noem of South Dakota to be the head of the Department of Homeland Security, under which, as a formal matter, immigration policy exists. Okay, ICE, CPB, all of those, CBP, all of those organizations that form the cluster of federal law enforcement relating to immigration fall under DHS. But it's quite clear that he intends that Misters Miller and Homan will be calling the shots, and whoever runs DHS is going to be taking orders from those individuals. That's certainly the best way to streamline the policy from just a purely managerial point of view. And Kristi Noem will have her hands tied with the vastness of the DHS portfolio, which includes also the Secret Service, which is facing a period of change and tumult right now for obvious reasons. FEMA, which is busy every year and running out of money every year. So she will have plenty besides immigration policy to focus on, and we'll see if the governor of South Dakota turns out to be the best choice for that job. But when we say back to the future, it's kind of misleading only in the sense that there's a lot that's familiar here, but there is a lot that will be new. And that is a win-win situation for the honest reporter among us. Thank you very much for listening. I'll be happy to take any questions you might have. Do we need do we have a microphone we're waiting for, or we're just, there's no mic, right? No microphone?
You can hear me.
Yeah, sure.
So based on your experience with Eric Holder and DOJ in 2013, you flash forward 10 years later, you're thinking that the Obama presidency has had a lot of influence on the Biden presidency?
One need not refer to my experience under the Obama administration in order to readily make the observation that, of course, the Obama administration had a lot of influence on the Biden administration precisely because personnel is policy. And so many of the players in the Biden administration were people who had served at high levels in the Obama administration, like Jake Sullivan and Bill Burns, the two that marched off to Oman to start the Iran nuclear talks. Now they're CIA director and White House National Security Advisor. If we are intended, as a consequence of your posing that question, to contemplate let's say, the unspoken question of whether I think Barack Obama himself was secretly, or Valerie Jarrett or Michelle Obama were secretly pulling the strings, I don't subscribe to that. But it is clear that when it came time for Mr. Biden to be shoved aside, that behind the scenes, and we will learn more about this as well over time, that Barack Obama did play a critical role. But I tell you this, Barack Obama exists at about 60% approval ratings for the past decade or so. He's very popular in retirement, as typically presidents grow in popular esteem. Even the ones who are unpopular when they leave become a little more popular once they exit the stage. They become sort of nostalgic figures. Barack Obama will have to answer to history for his conduct in the Biden administration. Not a month before Mr. Biden was forced to step aside from the 2024 contest, there stood Barack Obama and George Clooney and others on a stage in Los Angeles collecting a record haul of $26 million for a single fundraiser in one night, telling us that he was fit to be president of the United States and that you should give your money to him for that cause. And for Mr. Obama to then help engineer this soft coup without ever addressing his earlier posture that this man was just fine to be the president, he will have to answer for that in some setting somehow down the line.
Thank you.
Of course. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
If the Ukraine-Russian situation was resolved so that Russia retained or regained some property in Ukraine, what do you see as the carrot that's going to be given to Ukraine to make them accept that?
What they want is a path to NATO membership, so that if they were a NATO member and they were ever attacked by anybody, again, with the number one culprit or suspect being the Russians, Article 5 would be triggered of the NATO Charter, which means that if any NATO country is attacked, then all must rise to its defense. That's what they wanted in advance of the invasion, as Mr. Putin massed all those tanks and personnel on the border. Their membership was blocked by Hungary. It is, as things stand right now, in all the symmetry and diplomacy of the Biden administration, they have made it so that there is a path to NATO for Ukraine. That path involves governmental reforms in Kyiv to stamp out corruption in the government, and some other steps they need to take to stabilize their economy and so forth. Obviously, they're on a wartime footing now. Much of the country is destroyed, so it'll be difficult to enact reforms when you're just trying to rebuild. But I don't think Mr. Trump's going to be willing to do that, to give them, let alone instant NATO membership or any kind of pathway to NATO membership, because Putin has made it clear for 25 years that he regards the development of a NATO presence literally on his border as unacceptable to him. And absent the indiscriminate bombing campaigns of the past 2 years, we might be inclined to credit that as a legitimate security concern. So it's unclear what the carrot could be if it's not NATO membership. There's always money. As Howard Hunt, one of the Watergate conspirators, was caught on tape saying when he was complaining that the hush money hadn't been paid to the burglars and their lawyers after they got caught in the Watergate. And he said to Charles Colson on the telephone, look, President Nixon's been reelected. We see no reason for you guys not to pony up at this point. And he said, it would be a shame if this whole thing blew apart for the wrong reasons, which it ultimately did. He said, but surely money is the cheapest of commodities. I love that. Surely money is the cheapest of commodities. Or as a friend once put it to me, if you have a problem that cannot be solved by money, then you've got a real problem. Yes, Reverend.
Has President Trump made a decision with the Secretary of Treasury for one of the candidates from our state?
Mr. Bessent, right? Is that, which one is it? Is that right? Yeah. Say again? From Conway. No.
Related to him, right?
As I walked in here tonight, no decision had been announced on Treasury Secretary. As I walked in here tonight, no decision had been announced on the Treasury Secretary. I am old and wise enough and experienced enough, Reverend, to tell you that reporters are best advised to eschew prognostication and stick to telling you what has happened. Van mentioned my association with William F. Buckley Jr. Raise your hand if one of the students only here, raise your hand if you know who William F. Buckley Jr. is. You know who William F. Buckley, who was William F. Buckley Jr.?
He was a pretty profound figure in the conservative movement.
That's right, a profound figure in the conservative movement. He's gone now, William F. Buckley Jr., but he was tall and handsome. He went to Yale. He was a champion debater. And he was really one of the first multimedia celebrities because he founded a magazine called National Review, which some of you probably see and read. And then he started a talk show called Firing Line, in which he would debate Muhammad Ali and senators and all sorts of people. And it went for 33 years, the longest running TV show in history with a single host. And he wrote spy novels and he sailed around the world. And he was just a pretty incredible guy.
And his mom was from Canada.
Yes, there's a South Carolina connection to the Buckley family. And I'm trying to remember why I brought him up. It was apropos of that statement, when you've got a problem that money can't solve, you have a real problem. And then you asked me to predict the Treasury Secretary. And I interviewed Buckley once, and I said to him, this was October of 2000. So Bush v. Gore hadn't happened yet, but the election was coming. Mr. Clinton's term in office was coming to an end. I said to him, Mr. Buckley, what ought a responsible historian to say about the Clinton presidency? And he thought for a moment, he said, and he had this weird, strange accent, this English accent. He grew up, he was educated overseas, but he was a New Yorker. And he'd say, a responsible historian, it seems to me, would first tell what happened. He said, right? So if I confine myself to that, I think I'm doing just fine. I want to tell you one more Buckley story, because in that interview, this was taking place at his maisonette, which is a French word I've only seen used in reference to Bill Buckley's house, which was this giant townhouse on the corner of 73rd Street and Madison Avenue on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, as upscale as it gets, And from when you stepped in there, you were stepping into the 60s. You had maroon paint and white trim and some giant white bearskin rug with the fangs bared and oil paintings of him and Mrs. Buckley from the 60s. And this is the year 2000. They had little trays with doilies with cigarettes laid out, and he was mixing mojitos at 11 a.m. I said to him, Mr. Buckley, because I was just, if I could have curled up in a fetal ball and gone to, and just taken up residence in that maisonette for the rest of my life, I would have been really happy to do so, honestly. It felt so warm and secure in there and just rich beyond imagination. And I just said to him, Mr. Buckley, when was the last time you felt insecure about something? Emotionally insecure, financially insecure, in a bad neighborhood after dark, anything at all. When was the last time? And he reposed in this grand setting and he said, Well, there have been some rather anxious moments at sea. He said, I remember in particular one horrific squall that came through. I wasn't entirely sure we weren't going to drown. And I said, what year was that, sir? And he said, 1958. So let's recap for a moment. I've just asked you, when was the last time you felt a twinge of insecurity about anything at all under the sun? And you have to dimly hearken back 42 years prior. That is a life well lived. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
James, we appreciate you. And for those of you here, we're going to have a reception for James.